Hello, and welcome to the unexplained pang of existential dread you feel just as you're about to drift off to sleep that uncomfortably wrenches you from the arms of peaceful oblivion and leaves you sitting up to turn on the light while sweating, suddenly aware that it'll be several hours before you feel okay trying to sleep again. I'm the darkness that will seep back to envelop you once you do, not good or evil, just present, and cocooning you in the vastness beside your deepest anxieties, both shielding and amplifying the unknown horrors that lie inches from your nose. Do you think empathy is nice? I'm an autistic person, and I have been such for most of my life. When I was 4 years old, I accidentally irritated a local benevolent witch by stumbling into her herb garden, and as punishment was forced to undergo her experimental vaccine, which unfortunately infected me with homosexuality, Judaism, and the aforementioned autism. I have been a semi-closeted Homestuck fan ever since. Being an autistic person influences and shapes all aspects of my identity and personal philosophy, and thus I can conclude that my diagnosis has played a large part in shaping the fact that I am considered a complete pathological narcissist. I am not ashamed of this. As I've spoken about previously in past works, due to the social and mental isolation I lived in as a child being autistic, I now meet the diagnostic criteria for the pathetically vague wastebasket category known as narcissistic personality disorder. My mission with my art and writing since coming to terms with this part of myself has been to essentially try and rewrite the mainstream cultural narrative surrounding mental illness through pitiful self-tokenization, in the hopes that one day people like me will not have to live in shame and fear of their darker tendencies, and be able to openly seek the help and support they need. Here, however, I would like to take on a slightly different approach. I will still be utilizing the lens of personal experience just to lend credibility to my ideas, but I would primarily like to dissect the cause of my marginalization at its source, and see if the curtain of objectivity truly holds up in the face of an autistic transsexual who discovered Michel Foucault at the age of 9. Empathy is most commonly defined as the secondhand pain or discomfort many of us often feel when someone else is experiencing hardship. It is considered a trait a person possesses that is semi-inherent and as something positive, even admirable. Although often misunderstood as synonymous with kindness or compassion, there is a key disconnect between these labels that is drawn upon the fact that empathy is typically understood as an immediate emotional response. Empathy is an experience. It is the expectation that all people will respond emotionally to another person or creature in distress, without conscious deliberation. Empathy is a fundamentally internal thing that typically incentivizes us to externalize our care and express kindness, which is an action. Thus, we define the separation between these concepts. Empathy is the sadness you might feel when you see a loved one cry. Kindness is your choice to care for them outwardly and actively. The simple fact that these two things are often used as entirely synonymous and interchangeable is symptomatic of the neurotypical paradigm that dominates our culture. In a situation where you witness the shortcomings of another person, shortcomings that you are materially unaffected by, your standard response is to feel a degree of emotional disruption yourself, be that guilt or just a situationally detached sense of sorrow for the other person, and subsequently feel the desire to remedy this disruption by helping the person whose pain you're experiencing second-handedly. According to this definition, which is not universal but relevant to the systemic social ableism I want to highlight here, empathy is a selfish experience. That isn't to say that it's morally bad to be empathetic, just that empathy in itself, in its purest, most unaffiliated essence, is morally neutral, and its presence does not dictate a person's capacity for good or bad. For example, while autistic people are commonly stereotyped as having a lack of empathy, we are just as, if not more, prone to experiencing extreme, heightened empathy. This fact is often used to campaign against our dehumanization by misguided activists, an approach that falls short of its mark on several counts. As well as implicitly affirming the notion that a lack of empathy is a net negative, and autistic people only deserve conditional support and compassion, this approach fails to account for the fact that hyperempathy can be incredibly distressing and even debilitating to the autistic people who experience it. Autistic people who are hyper-empathetic are not pure, wholesome beings tormented by their innate kindness. They are disabled, and they should not be infantilized through a narrative that encourages their distress, by painting it as somehow virtuous, or while alienating and demonizing any autistic person with different symptoms. Many autistic people who struggle with heightened empathy come across as more rude and socially unaware than those of us without any empathy at all. If an autistic person who already struggles with social interactions finds themselves in distress whenever they're in proximity to someone else having a bad day, often they will attempt to resolve this by avoiding other people altogether or attempting to distance themselves from anyone seeking their support. Lots of people entirely lacking the capacity for empathy can find supporting others much easier, as they are able to care for their loved ones without taking on any emotional burden themselves, which is also a trait that's very useful in fields like nursing and psychiatry. Taking these things into consideration, it becomes clear that empathy is not a black and white indicator of a person's ability to be kind, and to portray it as such endangers all shades of the autism spectrum, as well as anyone else who happens to experience an unconventional relationship with empathy. When I first received my autism diagnosis, I was met with a number of comments from less informed family members regarding how surprised they were, on account of how I always seemed so empathetic. Gross stereotyping aside, I found these statements incredibly confusing, because once I was provided with my first definition of empathy, I was 100% sure that that was not something that I experienced. Since then, I have of course come to realize that the people making these remarks were simply equating empathy to kindness. And by all accounts, I definitely was a pretty kind child, despite this sometimes being made difficult by my frequent inability to navigate social cues. However, it took conscious explanation from the adults in my life over several years for me to properly understand the discrepancy between how I saw acts of kindness and how other people saw them. One of the first psychologists I was required to see in the months following my diagnosis was a big believer in finding some kind of medicinal treatment for autistic behavior. She was also, incidentally, the first person to explain her definition of empathy to me. I remember her telling me that empathy is what makes us kind. She explained that when a normal person sees someone else in trouble, they feel as if they are also in trouble, and that's what keeps people from hurting each other. She said that the reason we are good is because hurting others hurts us. I thought this was the most abhorrent, disgusting, cruel, evil thing I had ever heard. I distinctly remember feeling overwhelmed by nausea and existential dread, as my brain failed to adjust to the jarring new concept I had suddenly been forced to grapple with, that were now all noisily swimming around in my mind, clashing against each other and shattering the fragile worldview I had only just begun to construct. On the one hand, I knew that I did not experience what she had described, and she had made it very clear that she thought this was a moral failing on my part. This woman was so convinced that I was the broken one, and I partially believed her. But on the other hand, the newfound awareness of how so many people supposedly experienced morality that I had just been exposed to was so horrific to me. I'd never thought about concepts like morality and acts of compassion this consciously before, and once forced to confront them through the eyes of this woman, this person who saw me as fundamentally defective, who thought I was a ticking time bomb of emotional abuse, I was overcome with a wave of panic at the disgusting selfishness that this woman seemed so sure was at the root of all human kindness. I despised the way she explained the world to me. I felt sick and terrified. Every act of kindness I'd ever been shown felt hollow and meaningless. I had always been taught to be selfless, to be kind without reward, but if this strange woman was right, these were empty values devoid of weight, and I was apparently the only person who hadn't realized. After all, an immaterial reward for kindness is still a reward, isn't it? And isn't the alleviation of empathetic discomfort just an immaterial reward? My child mind wasn't sure who the monster was, me or everyone else, and I was definitely leaning towards the latter, which was a terrifying thought. A theme commonly discussed within Jewish philosophical literature and historical texts is the ongoing debate surrounding the concept of spiritual and earthly reward for goodness. And something I found fascinating in my exploration of my faith through the musings of various thinkers is the way that within Judaism, the idea of reward within the afterlife is not as widely accepted as it is within Christianity. There tends to be a larger emphasis on discussing what it truly means to enact goodness, and how that interacts with the potential for reward, rather than an overall acceptance among everyone that being good is just following the pre-established steps laid out for us to get to heaven and avoid divine punishment. As I'm sure many of you know, Jews aren't exactly reluctant to ask questions, and this cultural environment has significantly allowed me to explore my own psyche and inner morality free of guilt, and better understand myself and where I stand here. The idea of true selflessness, kindness without reward, is a lot more complex than I feel many religious thinkers would like, and this desire for simplicity can result in a depressingly cynical view on human behavior and what goodness truly means. Despite selflessness being described as something we should all strive for, it is simultaneously understood by everyone that an emotional response of some kind should be behind any act of kindness, lest the act itself be seen as performative and not genuine. You could give someone $1 million, but unless you did this because their poverty made you sad, then your gesture means absolutely nothing. For example, a previously cold and disconnected person succumbing to their empathetic inclinations in order to help someone that they would not help otherwise is seen as an entirely positive and admirable thing. To me, looking through the eyes of someone who never got to take things like this for granted, the prolific acceptance of this idea that kind instincts are something we're animalistically enslaved to is incredibly disturbing. The fact that so many people are just so sure that our selfish instinctual urges are the only force behind the choice to be kind is an incredibly regressive way to interpret human behavior. We are not apes. We can think and analyze things like natural instinct with a critical eye, and this is not something to shy away from. It's something to embrace. You're not flying too close to the sun by refusing to blindly accept the oversimplistic narrative that is this supposed human nature. This is a fundamental part of what it means to be human. As a religious, whatever that means, person myself, I don't at all think that we are sinning by exploring ourselves and learning new ways to exist alongside our genetic and psychological predispositions, while still being independent and creative people. This applies to how I view my trans identity under God as well. I believe that God doesn't simply give us everything as is and demand that we leave it unchanged. All of God's world is subject to modification, and this is why we are given wheat and not bread, grapes and not wine. God's job is to provide us with the tools so that we may share in her act of creation, and this line of thought applies to the human mind. We are able to think, to contemplate, and being afraid of this ability and falling back on our animalistic natural tendencies is a denial of our true potential. We cannot both value selflessness and decry anyone who is kind without feeling emotionally driven towards kindness as insincere. This is an outright ideological contradiction. Empathy, as we understand it, is immaterial and instinctual. It is a morally neutral phenomenon wrongly characterized as a universal human nature that we have spiritually gentrified for the sake of alienating neurodivergent and insane people. Because we exist in a culture that is dominated by a specific mental archetype, there is this idea that one's truth lies in what is inherent to the mind, and what you choose to contribute to the world is only worthwhile if it correlates with your internal feelings. A person with no empathy who is kind is treated as an insincere actor, and this often drives those with low or unconventional experiences of empathy down a dark path. We are taught that our attempts to be good people mean nothing unless we fix the immutable genetic composition of our psychology and live up to a standard benchmark of animalistic conformity, which exhausts and alienates us and tells us there is no point in trying. This kind of thought-prioritizing way of understanding morality is ableist at its core, as it holds all minds to the same standard and fails to account for the wide spectrum that is the human mind. It is also an incredibly cynical worldview on the part of those who are inherently empathetic, as it undermines and discredits the choices they make to be kind, by implying that they only do so for their own emotional satisfaction. As a society and as people, we should strive towards a separation between the internal and the external. A person's mental state is not reflective of some kind of greater truth. It is a factor of an individual's life that they have no control over. We live the entirety of our lives according to one specific benchmark that is based on the neurotype that dominates our society and excludes anyone who deviates from the neuroconformist criterion, deliberately so. As human beings, most of us strive for incomplexity. That means we tend to find comfort in the idea that there is one specific correct way to experience the world, and that deviation from that way is inherently indicative of a corrupt moral state. Modern psychoanalysis was engineered this way by people who more or less comply with that benchmark. We tend to shy away from the complexity of the human experience because it raises so many questions we can't immediately answer. We find solace in thinking of other people in black and white, believing in some kind of universal and objective principle dictating what true human nature looks like. But in reality, human nature is that we are messy, fragile, intricate, and complex. The very nature of human nature is that it is inherently undefinable. And that is truly beautiful. Human nature cannot be objectified, pinned down, and claimed by any one person or group. And the attempt to do so is at the source of all oppression. We cannot live our lives desiring everyone to comply with our individual definitions of human nature, and we cannot live our lives in fear of these definitions being challenged. In order to move forward and become more compassionate as people, we must strive to shed the idea of universal truth altogether and embrace heterogeneity. We must live our lives critically and understand that all aspects of our personhood are under the influence of our culture at all times, and we must not undermine the choice of an individual to be kind. Redirect your cynicism away from human kindness and understand that the choice to be kind is entirely disconnected from the inner turmoil of an individual as far as you're concerned. To deliberately make an effort to leave the world a better place than you found it, to make a person's day just a little brighter, is an act of true goodness, and however you might feel or see the world as a person does not tarnish or take away from that goodness in any capacity. People like me often find it harder to be incentivized towards kindness. My NPD makes it incredibly hard for me to trust others and makes emotional vulnerability feel borderline nauseating at times. And I know that these experiences aren't uncommon with people like me, but and this is a direct message for anyone who's ever felt like a freak or drowned in guilt because of the way they see the world. Your struggles to be kind do not undermine your kindness. Not in any way, shape, or form. The ability to try and be kind without the promise of any kind of emotional satisfaction, or even with the guaranteed opposite, is a mark of a truly good person. That is admirable. That is virtuous. Bad people are people who give up on being good people, and no matter how much you feel like you're broken, evil, or unlovable, you are wonderful, and you are just as deserving of joy as anyone else. I love you, psychopaths, narcissists, freaks of all kinds. You are beautiful and you don't deserve to feel diseased. Empathy is to feel pain or distress at the pain or distress of another. Compassion is to treat the world around us and our fellow people with love and care, regardless of any reward, material or emotional. Be kind, not empathetic. Hello, it's me, that person from the video you just watched. I'm just here to say that I forgot to record an outro. I actually forgot to write an outro. If you don't know me, which I am assuming you don't, because I am not a known internet personality whatsoever, but I am currently trying to make YouTube a source of income, a source of money of any kind, basically. It's very hard for me to get a job. Most places just refuse to hire me. I'm not autistic enough for a diversity hire, but I'm way too autistic for just a regular hire. So things are tough. I can't really survive in any conventional workplace environment. I am guilting you right now. Please like and subscribe, please. I don't know why I decided to do something so personal and emotionally vulnerable if I'm trying to get views and subscribers, but I had a lot to say on this topic, and it's something that means a lot to me, so I appreciate, I don't know, the 100 people who will probably watch this. Thank you very much for giving me your time, and I hope in some way what I had to say affected you or helped you. That's all. Goodbye. Please take care of yourself. I love you all. I mean, not really, not in like a weird parasocial way, but I have a degree of love for everyone on this earth. Oh, also, it has been recently brought to my attention that someone that my little brother goes to high school with, watches my videos, which is terrifying. I don't know how the fuck you found me, but hello, and I just wanted to say hi if that's you, because I thought that was hilarious. I'm not gonna dox anyone, I don't even know your name. I mean, I was told your name, but it's not like I'm gonna fucking remember that shit. But hello!